So that's all nice. We're able to animate these divs here. But what if we actually do want to animate the addition of an item to the list? Or if I click on it, the removement of such an item. How can we animate this? We'll have a look at this now. Thus far, we only animated the div. Well, now it's time to add a new trigger to our application. So I'll copy the first trigger in this overall animations array here, this one here, and add it. Make sure to pick the right level where you add it. Should be on the same level as the other triggers, of course. Now, I'm going to name this list1. And there I only want to have one state actually, the in state, so that the element is on the DOM, is added to the state, it's in the DOM. The other state would be that we don't have the element because we just removed it or we just added it, so it kind of should appear. And that is a state handled by Angular 2, as you will learn. So the in state is, how should it look like once it finally is there? Well, I wanted to have translate x of 0 to be at the position I actually place it here in my HTML code. And I wanted to have, let's say, an opacity of 1 so that it is fully visible, not transparent. That is the one state I have here. Now I need transitions. The first transition, which is interesting for me, is when it comes in, so when I add it to the DOM. Here the end state is in, but what is the beginning state? Well, we could use the wildcard character, but there is a specific state for this case that an element hasn't been added yet. That's a void. So void is a reserved state name. You can't use it, you shouldn't override it. Void is provided by Angular 2 for cases where you do have an element in an end state which wasn't added to the DOM at the beginning. Or of course you could also add void as the transition to state. So if you remove an element, for example. With this, it should slowly appear. And we can see this in action by going to our app component, to our HTML file. And there on the list item specifically, we want to add a trigger as before, square brackets and then add, and then list1. And we don't need to bind it to anything because I will actually set up void to anything because I don't care what the specific state is. In is just a dummy here. You could use any name. I only have in here. We could have some logic in the code which changes the state of our list items, but here for the entering animation, when we add a new item, I don't care what the initial state is, and actually I never set it in this application. I never apply a state of in to this. I don't have a property managing my list element states. I do have it for the above examples, but here I don't care. I want to animate from not existent to any state. This is the animation I want to execute, and if I save this and we see this in action, let's add test here. And well, that is certainly not working as intended. So what's going wrong here? Well, the issue is clearly we have no starting state. Now it doesn't work such that we now set up void like this. Before we defined our states like this, but since void is kind of a built-in state, it now works differently. Instead, here in our transition, we now want to change this. We will use an array here where animate is placed in, but before executing animate, I will have another style method where I set an initial style, and this style will now be applied by Angular 2 right at the beginning. So when we add a new list item, it is appended to the DOM and it will instantly get this style by Angular 2 and then transition over this duration to its final style here. So the style I want to set up here therefore is an opacity of 0. And I want to transform such that it flies in, so translate x should be -100 pixels. And now if I save this, now we should see a nice animation when I actually add new items to the list here. You saw it up on the initial loading already, and now each new item is smoothly animated in like that automatically by Angular 2. It doesn't work for deleting though, so let's handle this next. Well, let's say for deleting we want to have it fly to the right. So to do this, I'll add a new transition here to my trigger. And here I want to navigate or animate from any state to any state would be possible too, but to void specifically. And here I want to start with the state it already has, so no need to define a starting state. Instead, my animate function should now have a final state, because here I don't have the problem of it snapping to some other state at the end. This should be the state it takes at the end. So here, with style as the second argument, as you learned it above, here I set up the state I want to have it, or I want to have it at the end. And there I want to transform to translate x plus 100 pixels to move it to the right, and to also fade it out by setting the opacity to 0 again. Well, and with that in place, the timing, let's have it at 302. Once it reloads and I click on an element, you see it smoothly transition out and being removed. And this is how you can animate lists, and the same would of course also work for ngIf, where you also have that behavior of something new being added to the DOM. Well, that was a lot, but I want to mention two more things, or show two more things. One is a more detailed control over the individual steps during the animation process here. We already saw that we can define multiple phases, but each phase gets the same importance. It would be nice if you could define some keyframes to specifically say, okay, you animate over 1 second, after 200 seconds you should have this state, after 500 seconds you should have this state, and so on. Well, we can do this. I'm copying my trigger here, a final time, and here I want to set up list 2, which in my template I bind to my second list here, which uses the same data source. So here add list 2 sets up the trigger to bind it, and then we can set up the animations here. Well, I'll leave the in state here, but for the transition, when coming in, I want to change this. Here I don't want to specify a normal array as I did before to have these different equally weighted phases. Instead, I'll pass an argument, which is still an array, but there in the animate function, let's say 1 second, I use the keyframes method as the second argument. This needs to be imported from @AngularCore. Now, the keyframes method here in the animate function allows me to be more precise which part of multiple styles I can now set up should occur at which timing. The overall animation will take 1 second, but I can now control which state inside of that animation should take how long. So here keyframes therefore is also an array with now the individual phases. And there I simply apply a couple of styles with the style method again. So let's say when we let it enter, it should transform, and at the beginning we have it on the left as before, minus 100 pixels. We also set up the opacity as before to 0. Now let's say we want to have another style during that fly in animation. Here we want to have transform, set this to translate x 50 pixels. Minus 50 pixels. So halfway there, because we want to end at 0, translate x 0 at the end. That is our final state up here. That. We want to animate the opacity to already be at 0.5. And then we have yet another style, let's say, where we want to say, okay, the transform function is now also almost there. So translate x is now minus 20 pixels, but importantly opacity is 1, so we're done when it comes to opacity, but we're not completely at the position we want to be. This will work like that. I can now save this, and if we let this reload, you should watch the bottom list. You already saw it up on the initial fly in, and you should see it if you watch the comparison to the top list. If I add a new item, this is much slower, and it starts fast and then takes very long for the last bit. The reason for this is that by default, all these steps here take equally long. I have 3 elements here in my keyframes array, and then every style is triggered after a third, for the third of a second. I can override this. By passing the offset property, I can say at which timing of these 1000 milliseconds in this case should you be at this state. So the first state is at the beginning, offset 0. Then here, let's say we want to be at this not after half of the time, which it would make sense because we are halfway in and halfway the opacity, but we want to be at this point after 0.3 of our animation time. So 30% of our animation time, so 300 milliseconds in this case. And we want to be almost done after, let's say, 0.8. And then I will add a final style here with an offset of 1 where I'm done. This is my final keyframe so that it doesn't snap at the end. Well, with this, if I let it reload, we saw it here upon the initial loading, and if I add a new item, it starts fast, but then smoothly finishes. This is how we use keyframes to control precisely which state we want to have at which time during the transition. That's important. Keyframes are for the time during the transition, so over the time of such an animate function. And of course, you could still have multiple animate functions as we had before. In that array you pass to the transition, you could have multiple animate functions, and each animate functions could have multiple keyframes, so unlimited possibilities here.